Claire always thought toys couldn't talk. Really talk. But Poppy's voice sounded too alive. Too real. She watched her sickly daughter Emily clutch the doll in her hands as if she were holding something more than a toy. The voice, frozen in time, whispered familiar phrases, but once Emily spoke back something the doll couldn't know. She is not alone. That voice already belonged to someone else. The first time Elliot Ludwig heard his daughter's voice frozen in time, he felt uneasy. The recording crackled in the speaker of the old tape recorder, breaking the silence of the laboratory. The child's voice sounded sonorous, too vivid for the machine. He watched the tape scroll, the sound repeating over and over, taking on a strange, frightening eternity. Stella sat on a high chair next to him, blonde hair, freckles, light dress. She clutched a rag doll in her hands, unaware that her father was trying to catch not only her voice but her very presence. He wasn't just recording sounds, he was creating a memory that couldn't be erased. She laughed as she listened to her own words come back to her from the speaker. Her voice wasn't just hers anymore. It was part of something bigger now, encased in plastic and mechanism, able to speak even when she wasn't there. Elliot stared at his daughter longer than usual. Memorized. The way her fingers ran over the fabric of the doll, the way she wrinkled her nose as she looked thoughtfully away. Everything that would soon be gone. The ribbon continued to spin. The voice sounded. Time moved inexorably forward. Stella was gone on a cold fall morning. The house was filled with silence, too loud after her ringing laughter. The leaves outside the window laid a golden blanket over the path she had once run on, but now only slow, heavy footsteps treaded it. Elliot sat in the lab, surrounded by her voice. The recordings played over and over again. Stella's voice came from the speakers, but she was no longer there. He couldn't let her disappear. Toys had always been his life, but now they were his salvation. He'd locked himself in the lab for days and nights, taking apart and reassembling mechanisms, perfecting the voice playback system. Poppy Playtime was to be more than just a toy. It was to be a memory. He carved every detail with special care, selecting material that resembled the touch of a child's hand. But most important of all was the voice. He selected the best recordings, edited them, put them together until he had something almost lifelike. Almost Stella. When he first turned the doll on, the room froze. "I'm your best friend." Those words, once spoken by his daughter, were now coming out of the mouth of a plastic doll. Elliot closed his eyes. For a moment, he could imagine that she was here again. That she was laughing again, playing, alive. But when he opened his eyes, there was only a toy in front of him. And that wasn't enough. The tape spun, the voice sounded, but time moved on. Decades have passed. The factory closed, its walls overgrown with darkness and dust, and Elliot Ludwig's name remains only in old documents and faded newspaper articles. Everything he created became history. But the voice remained. Claire didn't plan to stop at the market. After the doctor's visit, her head was buzzing, familiar, suffocating. Her thoughts flitted between appointments, prognosis, endless what-ifs. Emily was asleep in the back seat, her breathing quiet, barely perceptible, as if she were afraid to disturb the air around her. Claire turned toward the flea market almost automatically, hoping to escape the vicious cycle of anxiety for a few minutes. The market had a life of its own. Dusty books, porcelain figurines, and old toys lay in disorderly piles, waiting for new owners. She looked through the items absent-mindedly until her gaze locked onto hers. A doll. Small, in a blue dress, with red curls, she stood out against the faded junk. Her glass eyes glistened in the autumn sun, and the paint on her lips had not been erased by time. She looked surprisingly new among the forgotten things of the past. Claire picked it up, feeling the hard plastic under her fingers. There was a button on the back. She pressed it. The sound that broke the silence was unexpectedly alive. A child's voice, clear, tinkling, warm. Something about it hit her deeper than she could explain. When Claire returned to the car, Emily was already awake. The girl's eyes immediately found the doll. She clutched it to her chest with a kind of trepidation Claire hadn't seen in her in a long time. Weak fingers slid gently over the plastic cheek, as if the doll was more than just a toy. It was quiet in the back seat, but not the empty, pressurized silence Claire was used to. This silence was different. Alive. Claire began to notice strange things, but at first she didn't pay much attention to them. Emily continued to play with the doll, holding it close to her, and the doll, as always, said her phrases, "I'm your best friend," or "Let's play together." Everything was fine. But one day, sitting in the chair, Emily suddenly said the words the doll had never said. "You're not alone." Claire froze. Emily hadn't pressed a button. The doll couldn't have said those words. They were her own words, words Claire had often said to her daughter to comfort her when the sickness became too much. But how could the doll know that? At first, Claire thought it was an accident. But the next day, when she entered the room, Emily was sitting on the floor, holding the doll tightly. Claire heard the girl say again, "It doesn't hurt, Mommy." Those words were definitely not part of the doll's speech. Claire froze in place. She looked at her daughter, who smiled and continued to play, not noticing how her voice sounded all too familiar. More and more, Claire began to feel that the doll was somehow reacting. The voice seemed to be alive, and something about it was strange and frightening. Claire could no longer ignore that the doll was saying phrases she wasn't supposed to know. She felt a chill run down her spine. Something was wrong. But so far she couldn't figure out what it was. Claire couldn't forget the words Emily had said to the doll. Every day she felt more and more that something was wrong. Poppy seemed like an ordinary toy, but not for her daughter. Claire began searching for information about her, and soon discovered that it was more than just a doll. At the old flea market where she'd bought her, the vendors couldn't tell her anything. But the internet proved to be much more informative. Reading numerous forums and blogs about rare toys, Claire came across a mention of the Playtime Company factory. This factory's toys had a reputation, but the history of the Playtime Company was dark and mysterious. The factory was shut down in the early 90s, after a series of mysterious accidents. The company's products, including the Poppy doll, were discontinued. An apology on the factory's official website did not explain the reasons, and rumors and speculation only added to the mystery. Claire felt she had found a clue. Unable to stay without an answer, Claire decided to visit the old factory archives. It wasn't easy, the building was abandoned and sealed, but she managed to gain access through intermediaries, and soon found herself inside. In the semi-darkness between the dusty boxes and old documents, Claire felt a strange feeling overwhelm her, as if she were breaking someone else's silence, invading someone else's personal pain. It was here, among the forgotten papers, that she came across the letters. Letters from Elliot Ludwig that he had written to his daughter Stella. These letters were full of pain and fear, even despair. He described how he couldn't let go of his daughter, how he was living with her loss. He talked about how his life had no meaning without her. In one of his letters he wrote, "I can't forget you, Stella. If only I could keep your voice, your presence. Maybe it's crazy, but I want you to stay with me. If only through Poppy, if only somehow." Every word cut Claire like a knife. She couldn't believe the truth she was searching for was hidden in those lines. Stella's voice was really captured in the doll. Poppy had been created not just as a toy, but as Elliot's attempt to get his daughter back. When Claire delved deeper into the archives, she found something even more shocking, an audio recording. It was damaged by time, but when Claire turned it on, Elliot's voice pierced the silence. There was obvious pain in his voice, suffering. He was crying. "Stella. Please stay with me. Stay through Poppy. Don't go. Please." Claire felt her heart clench. This wasn't just an experience of grief. It was something more, something unimaginable. Poppy was more than a toy. This was a father's last attempt to get his daughter back. Poppy held not just her voice, but her soul. And now perhaps she could communicate with those who were ready to hear. When Claire got home, everything seemed the same, but the tension was building. Emily, as always, was holding Poppy in her arms. This time, playing with the doll, she said quietly, "She's not alone." Claire felt the chill run down her spine again. The phrase was foreign, unfamiliar. It couldn't have been said by a doll. But how could it have been said by Emily? The doll was suddenly silent. The electronic mechanism stopped working. Poppy no longer spoke the familiar phrases, despite repeated button presses. And at the same moment, Emily fell back into a fever. Her breathing became heavy and her skin pale as it had never been before. Claire felt her whole world crumble. She realized that she had lost not only her daughter, but also a piece of the very bond that the doll symbolized. Emily's words had become ghosts, and Poppy now seemed part of something far more dangerous than just a toy. Claire could no longer sit in the shadows of fear and ignorance. She knew she couldn't just leave things as they were. Everything she had learned now rang in her head like an inescapable sentence. She looked at her daughter, who was growing weaker by the day. Emily needed saving, and Claire couldn't let this bond between doll and girl disappear. She went back into the archives of the old factory and found what she was looking for, the original voice module that had been used to record Stella. It was a key piece, and Claire, feeling internally uneasy, installed it in Poppy. At that moment, she didn't know what would happen, but there was no room for doubt in her heart. She had to restore that connection, if only for Emily, if only for that spark of life that could come alive again. A dark evening descended on the house. Claire sat in a chair beside Emily, who held a doll in her hands. Her small face was pale, as if life itself had wiped the last of its strength from her. But there was resilience in her eyes, something Claire had seen in the early days of her daughter's illness. Emily whispered softly, hugging the doll, "She's not alone." At that moment, Poppy activated again. The doll began to speak, but it wasn't something Claire had heard before. The voice was quiet, almost barely audible, but alive. It wasn't as it had been before, mechanical, empty. There was real life in it, an energy that was impossible to ignore. It was Stella's voice, but now it didn't sound from the past, but somehow different, as if she was here with them, despite everything. "You're not alone." Claire felt her heart sink and tears filled her eyes. That voice wasn't just an echo of the past. It was a voice that had crossed the boundary of time and space to connect two girls, one who was lost and one who was still fighting for life. Elliot Ludwig's belongings were left in an abandoned factory, amidst dust and oblivion. His name was forgotten, and the factory became an empty space with nothing but echoes of his pain and hope. But despite all this, his daughter's story lived on. Poppy was more than just a toy. She became a bridge between two worlds. Stella and Emily, two girls who would never meet in reality, were now connected through this doll. The voice of the past became a light and hope for the future. As Claire closed her eyes, in the silence of the house, She felt its presence still lingering. And perhaps it wasn't just a voice. It was a bond that is as eternal as the love of a father striving to keep his daughter safe and a mother willing to fight for hers. If you enjoyed the story and want to know more, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. We're always happy to share new stories and ideas. Leave your comments, we value your opinion and are always happy to discuss the plot, characters, or even hear your own versions of events. Your participation helps us to become better.